The Choice Bastogne, Belgium, January 3rd, 1945. One shot. That's all it would take, I figured, as I warmed my hands around the campfire with a few other shivering soldiers. One shot, and this frozen hell of Belgium's Ardennes forest would be over for me. It was January 1945, 7 months since me and the guys in the 101st Airborne's 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had jumped into that dark sky over Normandy. Now a handful of us E Company guys were numb from war, death, and bitter cold and snow. In the flames' flickering light, I looked down at my boots, wrapped in burlap bags and purposely dipped in water so they'd freeze and keep my feet warmer. One shot and those damn feet would never be cold again. One shot and the sight of Joe Toy and Bill Garnere lying in the snow, each missing a leg, would never haunt me again. Why Toy? Why not the SOB who I'd seen a few days ago, slicing fingers off the dead German soldiers to get their rings? The guy who was almost smiling when he told me cutting those fingers was just like cutting a candle in half. Toy was wounded in Normandy, Holland, and once here, coming back with his arm in a sling to fight. Maybe I'm biased because, like me, Joe was Irish, but hadn't he already paid the war piper? And why Guarnere? He gets it trying to save Joe. The Germans are raining down artillery shells like a 4th of July show gone wrong, and Bill sees Joe out there trying to get up and so runs across the snow to save his buddy. Sort of like one swimmer trying to help another swimmer who's drowning. And boom, both end up drowning. At least it hadn't been Skip Muck, whose first platoon was a few hundred yards away from our second. He was closer than a brother to me. I blew on my cupped hands to warm them up. I then put my right hand onto the pistol's holster and around the wooden grip, cold as a frozen salmon. We were virtually surrounded by the Germans, the proverbial hole in the donut, and had been here for more than 2 weeks, though time wasn't easy to keep track of when you couldn't see beyond the fog and snow of some ice-boxed forest that's so far from home that you can hardly remember what home is like anymore. Sometimes in the night, when the quiet wasn't feared as much, I would remember home. Not so much my family or our house in Astoria, where I'd grown up near where the Columbia River meets up with the Pacific Ocean, but the cabin. It was snug to the Nehalem River, in Oregon's Coast Range. I lived like an Indian, swam in the Nehalem each day, dove for crawdads, went bird hunting with a bow carved from a yew tree. While crouched in a foxhole in Bastogne, I remembered watching the riffle in the river, knowing that beneath that water lived sea-run cutthroat trout and crawdads galore. I remembered easing into the current and letting it take me, fishing pole in hand, wherever it might. I remembered fires on the banks at night, the sound of a hoot owl, and the smell of late summer blackberries. All things that now didn't seem possible. Unless... One shot. I looked at the flames and fingered the pistol. A P-38 I'd picked up from a German we'd taken prisoner in Holland. One shot and I'd be back to all that. Not a shot in the head, though a few soldiers were known to do that too, but in the foot. Hell, there's no sugarcoating it. This was a coward's way out. It wasn't common, but it happened in war. One squeeze of the trigger and you'd be unable to fight. You'd be a liability to your company, so they'd have no choice but to ship you back to the safety of England, maybe even the States. Accidents happen. But would the guys really buy that your gun had accidentally gone off? Don Hubler's had just yesterday, but he bled to death on the way to an aid station. I'd make sure I missed a main artery. Regardless, the price for my ticket home would be my integrity. All these guys forever wondering, did Malark do it on purpose? But then, integrity is an easy thing to lose in times of war, accidentally or on purpose. And when you watch others lose theirs, it becomes easier to let go of your own. Hell, back near Utah Beach, you'd see the bodies of soldiers stacked up like so much cordwood. Where's the integrity in that? Or hear those stories about First Lieutenant Ronald Spears gunning down a bunch of German prisoners, even one of his own men, some say. Where's the integrity in that? Or even before the war, at Fort Benning, watch the drumming out ceremonies. The guys who couldn't cut it, the guys who weren't going to make paratroopers, would be marched up in front of everybody with a Tommy gun at their backs, and an officer would strip them of basically everything they had, including their pride. Where was the integrity in that? In war, you quickly realize that you're playing a game of odds. The longer you fight, the better chance you have of something bad happening to you. You die, you get wounded, you get sick, you get captured, or you quit. Like my father. He quit, not in war, but in life. Went bankrupt during the Depression. He was an insurance man, and just quit. Quit trying, quit caring, quit noticing anything and anybody around him. When times got tough, when he lost his business, my dad was like some 20-foot runabout trying to get over the bar at the mouth of the Columbia, crushed to splinters. My father missed World War I because he had been 90% blind in one eye. He was 4F, so he worked in a spruce mill making airplane parts. But World War I took the lives of two of my uncles, his brothers. Though I never knew them, they were my heroes. I felt a bond with them both. So much of a bond, in fact, that when learning that Easy Company would be shipping out, ultimately to fight the Germans, I felt the need to somehow avenge their deaths. To bring back something, some symbol, that would tell my family, I did it. I evened the slate, some sort of souvenir, like the pistol whose hammer in the chill of the Ardennes forest I now cocked. Truth is, I'd gotten to this point for reasons beyond Joe Toy and Bill Garneri getting their legs blown off. Beyond missing the Nehalem River, I also missed Bernice Franetovich, a girl I'd known from Astoria who was now living in New York, where she was a singer. I'd started to wonder if it was only a matter of time before everyone in Easy Company was going to wind up like those frozen Germans you'd have to all but step over when heading to an outpost. We were like the shipwrecked sailors on a raft, waiting for the sharks. I felt hopeless, numb. Not from the cold, as I'd been since we'd arrived in this god-awful forest December 19th, but from something that chills you far deeper inside you. Death. We'd lost more than a dozen guys in the last few weeks, some of whom were my friends. You see a dead enemy soldier and you say, at least it wasn't one of ours. You see a dead American soldier, one of your own, and you say, at least it wasn't me. You lose a friend and you say, to hell with this, get me out of here. At the same time, though this might sound strange, you almost envy the peace they now have. No more being cold, no more war, no more pain. All that bad stuff gets left to those of us who remain. Things started swirling in my mind, like a cottonwood bud caught in an eddy on the Nehalem. I didn't say anything because there are certain things soldiers don't talk about. Like a lot of other jabs of pain, say the time after we'd gotten back from Normandy when our laundry woman kept handing me clothes for dead guys who weren't going to be needing them. I stuffed it deep inside, thinking it would somehow just go away. It didn't. It just builds up, like carrying one more brick on your back and one more and more and more. And finally you say, enough. I can't walk another step. So I found myself standing in front of that fire, which was growing weaker and weaker as the late afternoon grew darker and darker. Somewhere out there, the enemy still lurked, waiting for morning, and me. And somewhere inside me, another enemy lurked as well, waiting for my decision. Soldiers around me smoked cigarettes and made small talk, but I didn't hear a word of it. Instead, I stared at the embers, mesmerized. Slowly, my right forefinger curled around the pistol's icy trigger. Bomber the Jungle Boy, Astoria, Oregon, July 1921 to September 1939. Maybe it was what they call destiny, a sign of what would become of me in the future. Then again, maybe it was just me being little Donnie Malarkey and doing a damn fool thing because I always had a little of the devil in me. All I know is that when I was about 12 years old, at a time when nobody in Astoria, Oregon, or hardly anywhere else in the world had heard of a man jumping out of an airplane while wearing something called a parachute, I jumped off the roof of our house on Kensington Avenue, clutching only a beach umbrella. How I didn't bust myself all to hell is beyond me. I just remember trying to avoid hitting the concrete walkway and somehow surviving the jump with only minor injuries that I didn't dare confess to my mother, Helen, and afterward believing more fervently in the law of gravity than in the ability of a 5-foot-wide umbrella to float an 80-pound kid 15 feet to the ground. Besides being one of the more daring kids in Astoria, I was the best marble player. As kids, we'd gather in vacant lots and shoot marbles, and I'd win over and over. On Saturday mornings, I'd stand on our front porch, and as kids came by, I'd toss back all the marbles I'd won from them during the week. I still remember some mother yelling at me, "You malarkey boy, come here." Some of our games were for money, and I guess I'd won a little lunch money from her kid. But marbles, if good business, weren't as exciting as more physical pursuits. My pals and I played war behind the house in a forest that seemed to stretch on forever, and I dreamed of someday playing football and basketball for Astoria High, the vaunted fisherman, whose rival down the coast was the seaside sandfleas. Basketball in particular was big in Astoria. Seems like every telephone pole had a rim nailed to it, though you had to be careful because much of the town was notched into a hill overlooking the Columbia River, and a runaway ball could wind up at the fish canneries 14 blocks away. Astoria won 3 state basketball championships in the mid-30s. A couple of Astoria players on those teams, Bobby Annette and Wally Johansson, would go on to the University of Oregon, and in 1939 helped the school win the first NCAA championship ever held. As a kid, I watched practically every game they played at Astoria High and wanted badly to play for the fishermen someday. Meanwhile, I not only thirsted for adventure but found it. Winters in Astoria usually meant rain followed by more rain. 70-inch years weren't uncommon. Growing up, I had no less than 11 ear infections that required lancing because of our dank winters. Summers were far better, particularly a bit inland, where our family's tented cabin was on the Nehalem River, about 35 miles from town. I would swim for what seemed like miles on a summer day up and down that river, my only audience the alder and fir and hemlock that lined the snaking waters. I imagined myself as an Indian living off the land. I'd row my boat upriver half a mile, make camp, build a fire and stay the night, trap chipmunks, hunt with my yew-wood bow, climb a ridge to Lost Lake. I was a curly blonde-haired Huck Finn, an independent cuss living the life of Riley. Beyond the books I had to read at St. Mary's Star of the Sea School, and a few about poetry, which I actually liked, there was one set that I buried my head in night after night, the Bomber the Jungle Boy series by Roy Rockwood. The books started coming out in the mid-20s, just as I was learning to read. They included titles like Bomber the Jungle Boy in the Swamp of Death, and Bomber the Jungle Boy in a Strange Land. I loved those books. I lived those books. I was the Bomber of Astoria, Oregon, at least in my mind. At the corner of 15th and Madison, a massive growth of alder saplings ran kitty corner to 14th and Lexington. I would climb up those slim alder trees and start swinging on a branch until it propelled me forward a bit. You'd let go of that branch and grab hold of the trunk of another tree, and before you knew it, you'd gone an entire block without touching the ground. Amazing! Astoria is known as the place where the explorers Lewis and Clark ended their journey west, then turned around. As a little boy, I'd read their journals. In Astoria, kids were spoon-fed Lewis and Clark as if it were our morning Malta meal, and how some of the men in the Corps of Discovery were going mad, mainly because of the never-ending rain, and 8 guys crammed into 20 by 20 log-built rooms at Fort Clatsop, just across Young's Bay from where I lived. It's the oldest American settlement west of the Rockies, founded in 1847, a few decades after John Jacob Astor, a rich New Yorker, first established it as a fur trading outpost. By the time I was born, fur was no longer the draw. Instead, it was fish, lumber, and farming. The town lay mainly on a hillside in Oregon's far northwest corner, surrounded by water everywhere. The mighty Columbia River, separating Oregon from Washington, the Pacific Ocean to the west, and Young's Bay. It was a raw, rugged world that never let you forget life was tough, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. Logging, fishing, and shipping freight across an ocean weren't for the light-hearted. You'd show up for school one day, and the kid who sat next to you wouldn't be there. He'd be at the funeral for his dad the logger, who'd been crushed by a widowmaker. The Columbia's bar at Astoria, with swells to 40 feet, was known as the graveyard of the Pacific. And if we needed any reminding of such dangers, we could always see the skeletal remains of the Peter Iredale, a 4-masted British sailing vessel that had gone aground in 1906 on the Clatsop Spit. There were pockets of sophistication in Astoria, a lot of old money families who lived in the ornate Victorian houses perched on Coxcomb Hill. But, for the most part, Astoria in the 20s and 30s was the smell of fish canneries and salt air and lumber mills and dairy farms, of blackberries, cedar trees, And, of course, the crap that was dumped straight into the Columbia River from all our homes. It was the sound of ship whistles, seagulls, log trucks rolling down Commercial Street, and rain tapping on our windows, day after day after day after winter day. Astoria was warehouses jutting out over the river on pilings, brawls outside the bars and brothels of Astor Street, the Salmon Derby each August, playing baseball in the field notched into the hill behind Star of the Sea School, and a mix of people as different as the ingredients in a bowl of fisherman's stew. The Finns lived in the west part of town, nearest the Pacific Ocean, which pounded ashore about 10 miles away. The Danes, Swedes and Norwegians lived in East Astoria, up into the hills. The Irish, including the Malarkeys, lived in the centre. Our house was a bungalow near the top of the hill, 595 Kensington Avenue, that had a white chimney smack in front, not off to the side like most houses. That chimney looked almost like a lighthouse. We had a great view of the barges and tugs, whitewater cowboys we called them, pulling and pushing rafts of logs, ferries going to and from Megla, Washington, 5 miles across the river, and ships heading to and from Portland, about 60 miles upriver. To the east of us, on the corner of Kensington and 14th, lived a rugged man named Michael Nolan, a bar pilot, one of the guys who guided ships over the feared Columbia River Bar. From his porch he would tell us all sorts of stories, of shipwrecks, of miraculous recoveries, of rogue waves 3 stories high. Though not rich by any means, we were better off than a lot of folks during the Depression. My father, Leo, owned an insurance business in an office above the Liberty Theatre on Commercial Avenue. I still remember his ads. Tick Malarkey, that man insures anything. A slogan that the Evening Astorian budget would say was for a long time as familiar to local citizens as the Columbia River or Coxcomb Hill. He picked up the nickname at the University of Oregon, where he played football. As part of his athletic scholarship, it was his job to wind the clock at Villard Hall. Thus, Tick. He made enough money to send us to Star of the Sea and my brother John to prep school in Portland, also enough so he could play golf and my mum bridge at the country club. I was born July 31st, 1921, one of 4 children. John, about 2 years older than me, taught me to fish on the Nehalem near our family cabin when I was 6. Bob was 5 years younger. Marilyn, I called her Molly and it stuck, was 15 years younger. My father wasn't around much. When we were at the cabin, he would work in town and come out on Wednesday nights. Then he'd go back to work 2 days and return to the cabin for the weekends. So most of the time it was my mum and my brothers and me. Besides my brother John, Louis Jacobson taught me outdoor stuff too, like how to shoot a bow and arrow and trap a chipmunk. He was half Indian. The way I spent so much time in the woods, some people joked that I was full-blooded. I remember shooting what I thought was my first quail. When I ran to where it had nosedived into some tall grass, I realized it wasn't a quail after all, but a robin. I felt like 2 cents. Sometimes I was made to feel bad even when I hadn't done anything wrong, like when I got nabbed by a Catholic nun at school for carrying around a chipmunk in my shirt pocket. I don't know why she was mad. I hadn't killed the little critter. Still, an angry nun was nothing compared to the terror I felt one day in the summer of 1933, when I was 12. My father had gotten me a job on a dairy farm outside town, on land where our cabin was, working with Jack Bay's nephew, Einar Glazer. Einar, in his mid-20s, was the strongest man I knew. He made Charles Atlas look like a weakling. I started every day at 5:30 a.m., milking cows, then cleaning the barns, and finally delivering milk in Einar's old Chevy pickup. I enjoyed the job. It made me feel important. Out on the Sunset Highway, we'd deliver milk to logging camps and a construction company. The logging companies would send riders on horseback to pick up their orders. One day, while on a delivery, I was in a camp mess hall, eating a cookie and drinking a glass of milk. A cook named Oni Kelly always pampered me, when an out-of-breath farmer burst through the door. "Everybody out," he shouted. "Forest fires heading this way. Heading for Ben Gronell's place." We fled west, down Sunset Highway and back to the dairy farm. I spent the entire day with a bucket in my hands, dipping water from Lost Lake Creek and dispersing it to farmers as they yelled for it, trying to save the farm. And we did. My hands were bleeding from the handles on the pails. I'm surprised any water was left in that stream, given how fast we were working, but it made me feel sort of heroic, like a real man instead of a little kid. I'd been up since sunup. It was now about 10 p.m. Finally, my boss, Mr. Glazer, drove me back to our family cabin. My folks were worried sick, which made me feel a little guilty and a little good at the same time, if you know what I mean. I got a sandwich and some water to drink, then went to bed. My brother Bob and I had a double bunk. An hour later, I heard people stirring. "Bob, Donny, get up!" My father shouted. "Fire's coming!" The winds had shifted. Our cabin was smack in the middle of an old-growth Douglas fir forest. Limbs were torching into fireballs and falling far too close for comfort. You could hear the crackle, nearly feel the heat. We threw everything we could into the car and a little trailer. I took the stuff I valued most, my camping gear. Then all 5 of us headed out to a 100-acre hayfield that had been harvested, safe from the fire. I remember being under this old wooden wagon. I lay there all night long in a sleeping bag, watching this wall of flames gradually gobble up trees and head for our cabin. About 3 a.m., a fireball exploded on Red Bluff, across the Nehalem. By morning, we all knew what we later confirmed. Our cabin was gone, swallowed by what would become known as the Tillamook Burn, one of the largest forest fires ever to burn in the United States. In one night, that wall of flame travelled 35 miles and took away the one thing that meant more to me than just about anything else. Just like that, our cabin, gone. I would lose other things in my life in the same sort of way. Here one moment, gone the next. I would lose other things more gradually, like my father. We were proud to be Irish, proud to be Malarkeys, and proud to be Americans. When needed, Malarkeys served their country. I never knew my uncles, but I grew up with the stories about them and felt as if I knew them. Stories about how Gerald had died in France. He was barely 19. Stories about how Bob was gassed in the Argonne forest. He survived and came back from the war, coached football for a year at Stanford, and spent the rest of his life being shipped from one veterans' hospital to another. His lungs were like burnt toast. He died at 31. My uncles were legends in Astoria and revered in our home. In my eyes, they were the equal of Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Notre Dame football, and the marvellous basketball teams at Astoria High. The scrapbooks with stories about Gerald and Bob were permanent fixtures in our living room. I looked at them often, showed them to my pals. On July 10th, 1918, my grandfather Daniel Malarkey wrote to his son Gerald in France, "I do not know when you will be at the front. However, I wish to state that were I your age, I would be there. I have every confidence that you will acquit yourself like a true American, and that fortified by your Catholic faith, you will be prepared for anything that may befall. Son, you are as much a crusader as any knight of old who wore the cross and went to battle with the slogan, 'God wills it.' Therefore, notwithstanding the tender heart of your dear mother, don't forget that we both want you to do your full duty, and know that you will." Gerald died almost a month later to the day in Château-Thierry in eastern France on August 11th, 1918. He'd been hit by shrapnel from a German shell. He was barely 19, the first soldier from Clatsop County to die in World War I. At the request of the mayor, businesses closed for 1 hour for his memorial service at Ocean View Cemetery in Warrenton. The Oregonian newspaper in Portland, where Gerald had briefly attended prep school, wrote he was a mild-tempered, quiet, lovable young fellow, talented and painstaking in his studies, strenuous and enthusiastic on the athletic field. An Army Honor Guard, the Astoria paper reported, fired a parting salute to the youngster who proved his mettle when his country called, and who, in asking permission of his parents to enlist, said simply, "Somebody must go." My other uncle's death from World War I was painstakingly slow. Bob was playing football at the University of Oregon when, as a sophomore, he enlisted. After struggling to survive for years after being gassed in France, he came to be known as Fighting Bob. One Portland newspaper columnist said when told he was going to die, Bob said, "Tell me another funny story. I'm just starting to fight." In 1926, my grandfather Dan Malarkey was in Denver at the bedside of his dying son. He sent this Western Union telegram to my father. Chaplain Sliney and I were called to Robert's bedside at 2 this morning. He is growing gradually weaker. His mental attitude is inspiring, and it is his request that I send this message. Stop. He is fully resigned to the will of God. Stop. If he is to pass at this time, he begs of you all, especially Mother, Edith, his wife, and his sisters, not to grieve unduly, for he will be released from suffering and at peace. Stop. He sends his dear wife undying love and blesses Mother for all she has been to him. Stop. His death made big news in both Portland and Astoria. He was buried next to his brother, Gerald, at Ocean View. The Evening Astorian Budget wrote an editorial called Two Graves. Today, the tired, battle-scarred, pain-racked body of Robert Malarkey is laid to rest amid the peaceful dunes of Ocean View. The new made grave close beside an older one, beneath whose mound there lies in sleep eternal his younger brother Gerald, who died on the field of Château Thierry. In those graves there lie the broken bodies of two young heroes, and there too the broken hopes of a father and mother. There is grief and sorrow there, but there is pride and joy too, and there is victory and triumph and glory. But there must be something more than this, if the dead shall know that they have not fallen in vain, and if the mourning parents shall know that the big price they have been called to pay is not wasted. Those graves and others like them must remind us that peace is the fruit of war, and that the victory such graves have bought is a vast defeat, unless it shall become an enduring victory for the cause of peace. Because I wasn't even alive when Gerald died, and only 5 when Bob died, I never mourned their deaths. But in hearing and reading about them, I took a pride in my uncles that I didn't take even in my own father. In part, that's probably why I felt so close to their mother, Ida, my grandmother Malarkey. The reasons for my feeling so distant from my father were far more complex. My father, Leo, met my mother, Helen Trask, in Portland, when he was a college sports reporter for the Oregonian newspaper. They were married in 1918. She was a gracious lady who worked hard, loved her family, and remained loyal to the man she married, which couldn't have been easy. My father was a well-liked guy with a life-of-the-party personality. At the University of Oregon, he starred as a halfback on the football team, though an eye injury forced him to miss his senior year. So he became an assistant coach. In fact, he coached his brother Bob, a starting halfback, in 1916, the season the University of Oregon beat the University of Pennsylvania in the Rose Bowl. The best thing about my father was hearing him tell stories of his being a ootball hero. He drank a lot. He was, after all, Irish. But early on, I don't recall its being a big problem, other than the time he came home loaded and made some slanderous remarks in front of my mum's sister, or the time he walked into the Liberty Grill on Commercial Street, where I was bussing dishes as a high school senior. He looked at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "There's my no-good son. You don't forget something like that? Ever." Mum was a loving woman and the family disciplinarian. She gave us our chores. She took us to church every Sunday at St. Mary's Parish, where I served as an altar boy. She also took us berry-picking along the Nehalem. I loved to pick blackberries and blueberries. It was much more fun than being an altar boy, and for a kid who felt most alive when he was outdoors, was maybe the place I felt closer to God too. Those were the happiest times, me and my mum and sister and brothers out picking berries. Pick 3, eat 1, throw 1 at a brother or sister, and save 1 for jam. Your hands and face would be the colour of deep bruises, and it smelled good and life was safe and easy. But the Depression changed everything. With money short, in the summer when I was 15, I started working at a seining ground located on a tidal island 15 miles up the Columbia called Jim Crow Sands, on the Oregon side of the river. The salmon were so thick people joked you could walk from Oregon to Washington on their backs. Our job was to corral them in nets and get them in boats, until I ran up and down a mountain in Georgia called Currahee. It was the hardest work I'd ever done. I was a boy among men. The seines were laid out by 2 tugs. One pulled the head of the net, the other the tail. When full, the nets were towed to the sandbar, where the tail of the net was passed to a team of horses that pulled the half-moon configuration in until the net was compact enough so our crews could get at the fish. Some of the salmon were nearly the size of ironing boards, and up to 50 pounds. We'd transfer the fish into wooden boats called slimes that would transport the catch to the canneries. We lived in logging camp-style rooms and were paid $3 a day, plus a 50 cents a day bonus if we lasted the whole season. I did, for 3 summers. In 1938, my father's insurance business, like the occasional dead Chinook or sockeye we'd find in our nets, went belly up, bankrupt. He was a good salesman but a terrible bill collector. He trusted people too much, didn't want to go after money that was owed him. And I admired him for that. Hell, you can't blame someone for being blown over in a storm, but you can blame them for not even trying to get back up. Months later, we lost the house. The folks told us they were moving out to a replacement cabin in the Cow Creek Valley, not far from our old one that had burned down. John, my older brother, was already living in Southern California with relatives, but Bob, then 13, and Molly, 3, were going with Mum and Dad. I would live with Grandmother Malarkey in Warrenton, across Young's Bay. There went our family. There went my friends in Astoria. There went my dreams of playing basketball at Astoria High. I'd made Catholic All-State in basketball for 2 years at Star of the Sea, but though I'd transferred to Astoria for my senior year, it was impossible to live in Warrenton and find rides home from practice each night. Instead, I played intramurals. It's not that I didn't like living with Grandma Malarkey. She was a wonderful human being. She was that woman who'd be visiting all the down-and-out folks who needed visiting. She had a certain holiness to her, almost as if she were a saint. She lived on Main Street in a yellow 2-story bungalow shaded by Douglas firs and fronted by a white picket fence with a huge garden out back. But she was recently widowed. She'd already raised her children, 2 of whom had been taken by World War I, and now she was being asked to do it again, at age 64. Meanwhile, my father retreated deeper and deeper into the dark, like a hermit crab wedged deep in the crevice of a couple of rocks, watching but seldom coming out. Years later, after he died, the Oregonian newspaper would say he retired because of ill health in 1940. But I don't remember him being sick. I just remember him going numb as if he didn't want anything to do with any of us, partly because of the bankruptcy, and partly because of the bottle he relied on to make him forget the bankruptcy. He was not exactly the guy who the Evening Astorian Budget had once reported had endeared himself to the University of Oregon football coach because of his fight. Malarkey literally works himself to death on the field, a reporter had written. When it is just about dark, and that is the time that Coach Hugo Bezdek says nowadays, take a lap around the track easy and then go in on the jump. Tick has just as much pep as ever. He and my mother weren't separated by law, but by every other measure. Mum would stay in the cabin and he'd spend time in Warrenton or Astoria doing who knows what. So with John gone, I became the one who had to help keep the family together, financially and otherwise. That's not why I was disappointed in my father. I could deal with having to take on more responsibility. What I couldn't deal with was my father giving up on himself, on life, on us. I don't remember thinking, I'll never be like my old man. Looking back on it, I believe somewhere down deep I vowed I would never do what he did. No matter how bad it got, I would never quit. On myself, or on those around me. As a high school student, I would never have been confused with my grandmother, the saint. Oh, I wasn't a big-time hellraiser, but if some garbage cans were getting kicked around on Halloween, you could bet my buddies and I were somehow involved. We rolled a few tyres down from 14th and Jerome, which was a little like rolling tyres off an Olympic ski jump. When Leland Wesley, at Star of the Sea School, made a rank remark about my girlfriend, Bernice Frenetovich, I slammed him against the wall and threatened to kick the hell out of him. Bernice and I had pretty much fallen for each other ever since freshman initiation, when we were blindfolded and I took her hand to help her up the stairs. I suppose I had a touch of rebel spirit in me, probably more so after our family broke up and I moved to Warrenton. I began smoking, not that other guys didn't. Music was a more serious addiction. The big bands, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey. We'd gather at the house of someone who was a good piano player like Bernice, or go somewhere to listen to records, or belt out a few songs around a beach fire some Saturday night if the wind wasn't blowing us from here to Hell's Half Acre as it often was. Not to brag, but I was a pretty decent singer. Before the big split, my mother would have me sing to her. In 1939, when Dorsey came out with that Hawaiian war chant song, I could nail it, tricky though it was. In the midst of the Depression, music was a release. Music was like salvation. Music made you forget that life was no longer as simple as rowing up the Nehalem to find a good place to build a fire and camp for the evening. At Star of the Sea, a Catholic school with 30 pupils, I was a decent student. The nuns made sure of that. Math was not their strong suit, but they pounded the other subjects into you, especially English. They made you break down sentences and examine every part as if you were some sort of word detective. They had us sing until we all thought we belonged on stage, and memorize poetry, which I actually learned to enjoy. As a senior, I was allowed to transfer to Astoria High, though an injury wiped out football for me, and I couldn't play basketball because of the difficulty of getting a ride for the 10 miles to and from Warrenton. Once, a teacher asked our class if we'd read the editorial in the previous day's Evening Astoria Budget about the possibilities of Adolf Hitler invading the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. I was the only one who had. Bernice's father, Louis, he'd come from Croatia, ran the Liberty Grill on Commercial Street, and I got a job there as a busboy. Her dad seemed to think I was okay, and I thought he was too. In 1922, the Astoria fire had levelled most of downtown, but in a time when a lot of people gave up, he rebuilt. I always admired that, along with the grill's hamburger steak and mashed potatoes. The grill also made wonderful clam chowder, heavy on the clams. Once, when President Franklin Roosevelt went salmon fishing on the Columbia, his aides would motor ashore and bring him back Liberty Grill chowder on his request. Bernice was proud of her dad for that, and who could blame her? One day at the Liberty Grill, this bar pilot looked up from his newspaper and asked me what I thought Germany was going to do with France. He was surprised that I actually had an answer. Germany, I said, is like the Notre Dame of Europe, powerful. France and all of Europe is in big trouble. The next day, Louis, the owner, told me a guy had overheard me talking about Germany at the counter yesterday. He was with the FBI, and sure enough, this guy wanted to know how I knew so much about the war in Europe, which seemed odd because I'd just been reading the papers. It was a time of great suspicion, those late 30s. The world seemed on the brink of something bad, but we just weren't sure what that something was. I graduated from Astoria High in the spring of 1939, and with my father and mother not working, I had no money to attend the University of Oregon, my school of choice. So I decided I'd put myself through school on my own. I got a job loading ships and blending flour at the Pillsbury Flour Mill in Astoria, at the time one of the country's largest volume export mills to the Far East. I stowed some money away for college and bought a '36 Chevrolet. I left Grandma's house and lived in an apartment that Bernice's father owned on Franklin Avenue. Bernice was still my girl. When she was selected as a princess in the Queen's Court of the Astoria Regatta, she naturally chose me as her escort. I worked at the mill during the day and bussed dishes at the Liberty Grill at night. One foggy September evening, on the northern Oregon coast, no month is safe from the stuff, I was cleaning up a table when I saw a copy of the Evening Astoria Budget, its front page ringed with the circles of a few coffee cups, and its main headline tinged with dread, "Fighting Underway." I had the same feeling I had had when the farmer had burst into the doors of that camp mess hall to tell us a forest fire was headed our way. "Mom, don't worry, I'll be back. Eugene and Astoria, Oregon, September 1939 to September 1942. I entered the University of Oregon in the fall of 1941, having worked 2 years and sold my car to afford it. I'd almost been predestined to go to UO, given the pipeline between Eugene and my older Astoria friends, and my dad and Uncle Bob having gone there. The college was about 150 miles southeast of Astoria, at the lower end of the Willamette Valley. Eugene was lush, rainy, but not nearly as wet as what I'd been used to, and sprinkled liberally with Douglas fir trees and coeds with beautiful legs. Elsewhere in the world, Germany, after the Czechoslovakia takeover and the conquest of Poland, was taking over countries with a sort of devil-may-care arrogance. Denmark, Norway, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and others, and bombing the hell out of Great Britain. America instituted a peacetime draft because President Franklin Roosevelt supported Great Britain, which had declared war on Germany after its invasion of Poland. America was sending the British money, weapons and machinery. The common thinking was that America's involvement in this war wasn't a matter of if, but when. Meanwhile, I tried to ignore the possibilities. In some ways, college was like a grown-up version of life on the Nehalem, an escape of sorts. I joined the Sigma Nu fraternity on 11th Street, where my father and Uncle Bob had been members back in the teens. I still worked, this time washing dishes at the fraternity and at a sorority, which, for obvious reasons, was more fun than working at my own house. Both jobs were far easier than tossing around 30-pound salmon or loading cargo ships. I partied, sang with the fraternity choir, and watched football games at Haywood Field and basketball games at MacArthur Court. I even went to classes regularly, deciding to get a degree in business administration. Bernice, who'd gone a year to Marylhurst College in Portland, transferred to Oregon when I began there. We dated for a while, but she hadn't pledged a sorority, and I took so much ribbing from my fraternity brothers that I broke up with her. That was a stupid reason to part, but when you're young, sometimes you do stupid things. What I remember most about that first year, other than a mandatory Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC class, all male students were required to take because of the war in Europe, were a couple of poems I memorized. On my entrance exam for the University of Oregon, I remember being told I was among the few newcomers who wouldn't need to take bonehead English because Star of the Sea had prepared me so well. One poem I learned at Oregon was Milton's On His Blindness. Another was Gunga Din by Rudyard Kipling, about this water boy during war who earns the praise of his military master. It reminded me of a certain 12-year-old boy carrying buckets of water out of Lost Lake Creek to help save a man's farm. I didn't think it was all that emotional a poem, but when I recited it in a freshman English class, 2 students in the front row were in tears. The other poem I loved, by William Ernest Henley, was called Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. It's strange how when you're young and learning stuff, you never stop to think that someday you might use whatever it is you're learning. But even though in the 30s I thought Invictus was little more than an inspiring poem about not giving up, I would, in war, find a strength in those words that sometimes got me through another day. "You don't seem like the poetry type," one of my fraternity brothers once told me. "I know you think of me more like the Frank Sinatra type," I said, laughing. One Sunday morning in early December, I was washing pots and pans left over from a Saturday night dinner at the house, when a fraternity brother rushed in. "The Japs have bombed Pearl Harbor," he said. "Where the hell is Pearl Harbor?" I asked, a naive question for a guy who'd been acing geography all through school. The big question in the fraternity that week was what branch of the service we were each headed for. Fall term wound to a close. I took my finals, though I missed an ROTC test because I was in the student infirmary with yet another ear infection. Then I packed for my trip home, knowing down the road I'd be off to war in some way, shape or form. I was a malarkey. That's just what we did. Never thought twice about finding some way out, even though I would soon be offered one. Everywhere you went, talk was of the war. I had a good friend from Astoria who was also going to school at the University of Oregon, a Japanese kid named Tom Hayashi. He was an excellent swimmer and basketball player. His folks ran some kind of store. Shortly after the bombing, I saw him leaning against the wall of the library, near a bunch of phones. He was crying. "What's the matter, Tommy?" I asked. He paused a moment and shook his head a bit. "Just talk to my folks back in Astoria. People are throwing rocks through the windows at their store." The idea sickened me. I never saw him again. Like most Japanese during those times, he was probably soon shipped off to one of those internment camps. On December 15th, I hitchhiked north to Portland and was in the bus depot when I noticed a Marine Corps recruiting sign across the street. What the heck? I had a little time to kill, so I sauntered over and took a physical exam. The doctor said I was 100% fit, except for one thing. After checking my mouth, he said my teeth weren't up to snuff. No explanation. Many years later, I learned the Marines had a regulation about having so many of your back molars, something to do with a medical device they would put in your mouth to knock you out for surgery, and I was a few short of regulation. I hopped on a bus headed for Astoria, and was reading the November 1941 edition of Reader's Digest. Among the articles was one about something called paratroopers, soldiers the United States was training in Georgia to jump out of airplanes, land and fight. Said the article, soldiers chosen must be unmarried, under 30, physically tops and emotionally well-balanced. When one of these picked men reaches Fort Benning, he starts through the toughest school ever devised for American soldiers. For 6 weeks he is hardened into a physical superman, driven through exercises which make football practice look soft. They are probably the hardest, toughest and best-dressed soldiers in the army. When he gets his jump training, he gets silver wings to wear on his blouse, and he is cocky. Thank God I'd flunked the Marine Corps physical. I knew at that moment that being a paratrooper was for me. I wanted to be one of the hardest, toughest and best-dressed soldiers in the army. I wanted to be hardened into a physical superman, wear those wings. Hell, I wanted to jump out of an airplane with a parachute on my back and be cocky. It seemed challenging yet simple. Go on a mission for a few days, fight like hell, get picked up, and return to your post. I arrived home for the holidays to the Cow Creek cabin. With nothing but the Pacific Ocean between Oregon and Japan, a touch of tenseness was in the air that hadn't been there before. The Japanese had attacked Hawaii. What would prevent them from bombing the mainland United States? And Astoria was a major shipping port at the mouth of the largest West Coast river to empty into the Pacific. The Army had already commandeered one of Astoria's 2 ferries to use as a mine layer at the mouth of the Columbia. I mentioned my plan to become a paratrooper to my mother. She broke down on the spot. 3 weeks of being at war had a lot of folks jittery about their sons. Hearing that I wasn't interested in a desk job but wanted to jump out of airplanes caught her off guard. My grandmother took it even harder. She was a Gold Star mother who had already lost 2 sons, my uncles, to war. Now the worries of war she'd experienced 2 decades ago were suddenly back, thanks to me. For the rest of my time at home, the proverbial elephant was in the room. I didn't want to talk about it. Neither did my mum or grandmother. So we didn't. I can't remember seeing my father. As I said, he was usually just somewhere else. When I returned to Eugene for winter term, I got a kick below the belt. My ROTC instructor, Colonel Swanson, had given me an F, flunked me for missing that fall term final. "You need to repeat the course, young man," he said. "Repeat?" "But I missed the test because I was in bed in the infirmary, sir," I said. "I couldn't be there." "That's not good enough. I'm sorry, but I had A's all fall. Can't I just take the test? I can prove that." "You'll need to repeat the course, Mr. Malarkey," he said with a "this discussion is" overtone to his voice. "But look, young man, we're at war, and I'm tired of fooling with college students who don't seem to appreciate that fact." Something welled up deep within. I was a Malarkey. I was from Astoria, home of tough, proud, independent cusses who believed at their core in a square deal, and this didn't seem too square. I turned my back, marched to the Sigma Nu house, got my olive-drab army uniform, and returned to his office. His receptionist tried to stop me. I blew right past her, dropped that uniform on his desk, and walked away. Swanson didn't say a word. Neither did I. Heading down 13th Street back to the house, I suddenly realized what I'd done.